So Prigozhin is a former petty criminal who rose to prominence as Putin's caterer. The pair probably met in the 90s in St. Petersburg when Prigozhin was running a gambling business and probably came across Putin, who at that time was licensing gambling businesses in St. Petersburg. After becoming Putin's caterer, Prigozhin took on extra roles where he started performing kind of additional tasks that the Kremlin wanted to distance itself from. He wasn't a Kremlin official, he's never had an official rank, he's just someone that's been close to Putin. So when Russia started its hybrid war against Ukraine in 2014, mercenaries were needed to maintain some kind of distance from the Kremlin, and Wagner stepped in and provided those mercenaries so that the Kremlin could deny that they had an active role in the conflict. And since then, Prigozhin has made a huge amount of money sending his mercenaries to Libya, to Sudan, to Mali and the Central African Republic, and is part of a big Russian ecosystem in those countries, which is bringing, extracting natural resources and bringing gold and diamonds back to Russia. So I think the relationship really started to fall apart probably as early as 2018, because you have everyone start to realize that Prigozhin is making a huge amount of money in Africa. He's got enormous contracts as a result of his Wagner mercenary group's activities. And the defense ministry thinking, oh, why don't we have a piece of this? So Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, forms his own private military company and is kind of jockeying with Prigozhin in order to try and get access to some of these markets that he's currently controlling. So there's a kind of a power struggle starting as early as 2018. And then with the war in Ukraine, you have Wagner being committed to fight in Ukraine, and it's performing quite well relative to Russian units. So they are sent into the hardest, the most difficult battles. And perhaps Shoigu sees an opportunity to reduce Wagner's influence and potential. And in fact, if Wagner is gone, then Shoigu's own private military company can take over these lucrative contracts in Africa. Prigozhin has been attacking Shoigu very personally and limiting his attacks to the defense ministry and saying the conduct of the war is not going well. And partly he does that because it's popular. But then we see a surprising change of tack in May when during the Victory Day parade, Putin is overseeing a much reduced display of Russian military hardware. But Prigozhin comes out at the same time as Putin is speaking and criticizes this parade and saying this hardware should all be in Ukraine. Why are we wasting it on Red Square entertainment? So this is a surprising mark of disrespect against Putin. And I think the reason for that is perhaps that he's hoped that Putin at some point will come to his side, or he'd have a meeting, or he'd have access to Putin to try and resolve the dispute with Shoigu. And Putin just hasn't done that. Putin has ignored him. So I think the relationship is one of kind of business competitors between Shoigu and Prigozhin. They are people who are vying for income streams, essentially, and very lucrative Kremlin contracts in the private mercenary field. And Putin ultimately is the person that will decide who makes the most of those, and who will get the money. So there is a kind of vying for daddy's attention in some respects there. And I think Prigozhin is upset after months of this feud playing out that Putin hasn't stepped in to reward him or praise him or acknowledge even the fact that Wagner has been sacrificing quite a lot in Ukraine to make some relatively good gains compared to the rest of the Russian army. So we see that the Wagner group fulfills its promises to start withdrawing its troops from Bakhmut, obviously tired it's taken so many casualties and its power is being drained in this way. And as they're withdrawing, they get hit, or at least Prigozhin claims they get hit by artillery fire, which looks like it's coming from the Russian side. And he complains about this. Again, nothing happens. There's no response from Putin. And so they then capture a Russian commander who Prigozhin says is responsible for it. They torture a Russian military commander who's a lieutenant colonel. And the commander says under duress that he has ordered his men to fire on Prigozhin. So now you have Russian troops on the same side shooting at each other and capturing each other. And that's the beginning of the unraveling. I think what he was hoping for is that by playing it this kind of public persona by voicing a lot of the concerns that the military have and the public have about the way that the war is going, that he would achieve some level of popular support that maybe would protect him then if Shoigu came after him or Putin decided you're dispensable. Because one of the reasons that Prigozhin was so useful is that they had this veneer of deniability about whatever Wagner was doing. And Prigozhin had never publicly acknowledged that he was the founder of Wagner or had a relationship with Wagner. So Wagner was this unknown Russian entity which was operating in all these countries, and the Kremlin could say it had nothing to do with it. As soon as we know that Prigozhin is in charge, then we know that there's a direct link to the Kremlin, because we know that Putin and Prigozhin are close, and we know that the catering contracts that Putin has with Prigozhin. So he outlives his usefulness in a way when he's revealed that he's in charge of Wagner. So Rostov-on-Don is a really significant city because it's played a huge role in Russia's prosecution of the war in Ukraine. It's a really important military hub. It's a city of over 1 million people. There's a southern military command's headquarters is there. And a lot of the command staff are in that city. And Prigozhin presumably hoped that if he caught them off guard, that the head of the armed forces, Valery Gerasimov, and Sergei Shoigu might be there at the time that he captured it. So Putin comes out and says this is treason, because he wants to identify, you have to make a choice here. You're either with Wagner or you're with me. And he wants to identify who the people are that might come out and support Prigozhin. And he can then say, okay, well, you are treasonous and you are my enemy. So he's making sure that people have to make a choice, because he's worried about this situation when no one makes a choice, and in fact, by proxy, they do make a choice, because the military, his security forces in Rostov-on-Don, they just stood by and did nothing. So a source in Ukrainian intelligence has told me that the reason that Lukashenko was brought in was because Prigozhin wanted to talk to Putin. It's again the continuation of this trying to get Putin's attention, and Putin didn't want to speak to him. He was beyond speaking to them. And so Lukashenko was brought in as a head of state that might kind of placate Prigozhin's demands for a kind of top-level attention. But really, I think it's very unlikely that Lukashenko really had any role in the mediation. I think offers were put through him, but not by him. So these events have certainly demonstrated that Putin is not as strong and all-knowing, as all-powerful as he had set himself out to be. If somebody can challenge Putin and march on Moscow with a sizable military force and then escape to Belarus and not be punished, that demonstrates a clear weakness. And you'd expect in a system like the Russian system, where all power is based on strength, that is now opening a door for others to make similar challenges. And we already see that people are talking about Putin in a different way, and they're more dismissive of Putin, talking about him as a grandfather, talking about him as senile, and these are some people that had been supporters of him in the past. So I think it's opening the door for more dissent, more criticism. Unfortunately, it's not going to be the liberal Russian voices, because they've all left the country, but it's probably going to be these kind of more nationalists, more hardliners, people that want to see the war in Ukraine prosecuted harder, more effectively, who start coming to the fore now. It was remarkable how undefended Moscow was and how easy it was for Prigozhin to get as close as he did to Moscow. And I think a large part of that is due to the apathy of Russian troops and the security forces, firstly, who let them into Rostov-on-Don without firing a shot, and then the only people that seemed to attack the Wagner column were the Air Force. And that's got to be worrying for Putin. There were people there, but they didn't take up arms to defend the city. It probably would have been a different matter once Prigozhin had got to Moscow. There are still considerable forces there. And it would have been a real test of loyalty then to see what they had done. And it's a shame for all of us watching to see, to not be able to see what the result of that would have been. But it certainly doesn't look good for Putin that so many people stood by, so many people didn't come out and say anything. Lots of people are now claiming, it was a weekend, I was away, I was on holiday and things like that. But I'm sure Putin would have hoped for people coming out and saying, condemning this instantly and making clear that they support him. And certainly Lukashenko is not going to be able to guarantee Prigozhin's safety in Belarus. Lukashenko has not been able to secure sovereignty for his nation. It's slowly being dragged and absorbed into part of the Russian Federation and used as a staging post for the invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, Lukashenko looked very unwell at the May Victory Day parade in Moscow. So I think Prigozhin's only hope of staying safe is if he can keep part of Wagner around him and if he can keep them competent. So the idea now that is mooted as part of this deal that Wagner will hand over its heavy weapons to the defense ministry, I think is going to be another sticking point where there's going to be room for conflict. The previous one being that Prigozhin's Wagner group were asked to sign contracts with the Russian Ministry of Defense, which is obviously something that would take them out of his control. And he again won't want to see that because they are the thing that are keeping him alive at the moment. You know, he's led a march on Moscow. He hasn't necessarily communicated to all the rank and file of Wagner, you know, why he's doing that and what the kind of end game is here. And everyone may have had their own interpretations of what was happening and what their role in it should be. And obviously they're probably going to be worried about repercussions against them because they're less well protected. So you could see people maybe thinking about turning against him. But on the other hand, you also have a group of mercenaries who over the years have received a lot of money. They've done very well out of working with Prigozhin, and they see themselves as different from the Russian military and don't want to be used by the Russian military in the war in Ukraine, for instance, wasted and squandered and see all their colleagues die. So there are going to be a lot of hard decisions, and he must be having conversations with Wagner fighters that we're not privy to and we don't know about in order to keep them on side. It's very difficult to say whether it's worth it for Prigozhin. I think he's in stages fallen into this situation. He's criticised Shoigu, he's had this rivalry with Shoigu, and that's escalated. Then he's outlived his usefulness because he's announced that he's in charge of Wagner when the whole point of him was to keep it separate from the Kremlin. So he's always looking for a way to avoid being bumped off, and at each stage he's had to go further and further in order to do that, ultimately leading with this march in Moscow. So I don't think he's been able to step back and say, is this going to be the right call? Because he's probably already worried that someone's trying to kill him, and he's looking for the next short-term solution to it. So the rebellion will have impacted the morale of the Russian troops, and those that have found out about it will be worried and concerned about what's happening in Russia, what might happen to their supply lines, why they're fighting against the Ukrainians when Wagner has come out and said actually this war is bogus and none of the ideas about denazification and demilitarization are true. But it's not the same as if Prigozhin had even sat in Rostov-on-Don for a whole week, which would have incredibly disrupted supply lines and ammunition and fuel deliveries to the front line, and that would have given Ukraine a real window to capitalize on. That hasn't happened, so Ukraine is still making these systematic gains under very difficult circumstances because it doesn't have air superiority for the counteroffensive. But I think the morale question is an important one and will play a role in the longer term as Ukraine continues its counteroffensive. And you can find more of my articles and analysis on the Times website.